The cameras were rolling live when a Medal of Honor recipient called Muhammad Ali a coward in front of 30 million viewers. What happened next in those tense 12 minutes would become one of the most powerful moments in television history, transforming both men's lives forever and proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying your opponent, but from revealing their humanity. This isn't just another celebrity confrontation story. This is about the moment when moral authority met moral courage, when military honor faced a different kind of honor, and when two men who seemed to represent irreconcilable differences found common ground in the most unexpected way. If this story of grace under pressure moves you, subscribe for more untold moments that reveal what true character looks like when the whole world is watching. March 15, 1973, Studio 6B at NBC's Rockefeller Center hummed with nervous energy as The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, prepared for what would become the most controversial segment in the show's legendary history. Johnny Carson sat behind his iconic desk, adjusting his tie with unusual nervousness as he prepared to host two guests who had no idea they were about to create television magic and mayhem in equal measure. The red, on-air, light glowed ominously above the cameras, and Carson could feel the weight of 30 million viewers settling into their living room chairs across America, expecting nothing more than routine entertainment. What they were about to witness would challenge everything they thought they knew about courage, patriotism, and what it truly means to serve your country. The first guest was Colonel James Patterson, a 42-year-old career military officer whose chest bore the weight of America's highest military honors. The Medal of Honor hung prominently among his decorations, earned during a horrific firefight near Da Nang where Patterson had single-handedly held off a Viet Cong assault for 6 hours, saving his entire platoon while sustaining 3 bullet wounds and a piece of shrapnel that doctors said came within millimeters of his heart. 2 Purple Hearts flanked the Medal of Honor, testament to wounds received in earlier engagements where Patterson had repeatedly placed himself between danger and his men. A Bronze Star with V device for valor spoke to additional acts of heroism under fire. These weren't ceremonial decorations. They were earned through blood, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that most people could never imagine possessing. Patterson had enlisted as a private straight out of high school in rural Kansas, driven by a sense of duty that ran through his family like a genetic trait. His father had served with distinction in World War I, earning a Silver Star at Normandy. His grandfather had fought in World War I, surviving the hellish trenches of the Western Front. Military service wasn't just a career choice for the Patterson family. It was a sacred obligation passed down through generations. He was a genuine American hero in every traditional sense of the word, invited on Carson's show to promote his upcoming book, Leadership Under Fire, Lessons from the Battlefield, which had already become a bestseller among military families and business executives seeking to understand how ordinary people become extraordinary under pressure. The second guest was Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, who had agreed to appear on the show to discuss his upcoming fight against Ken Norton, scheduled for later that month. Ali's presence on mainstream television was still somewhat controversial in 1973, just 2 years after the Supreme Court had overturned his conviction for refusing military induction. But his box office appeal was undeniable, and Carson's producers knew his appearance would guarantee massive ratings. The champion had spent the afternoon at a Harlem mosque before flying to New York, participating in prayer and meditation that had left him unusually contemplative and peaceful. He sat in the green room joking with his handlers and signing autographs for starstruck NBC employees, his famous wit and charm on full display as he entertained a small crowd that had gathered to catch a glimpse of the most famous athlete in the world. Ali was wearing an elegant dark blue suit with a silver tie, his hair perfectly styled and his confidence radiating through every gesture and smile. At 31 years old, he was at the peak of his physical and intellectual powers, his quick wit as legendary as his lightning-fast hands. He was completely unaware that the next hour would test his character in ways no boxing ring ever could, that he was about to face an opponent far more dangerous than any heavyweight contender. Carson opened the show with his usual monologue, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his voice as he prepared to bring out his first guest. The producers had briefed him on Patterson's military record, but they hadn't mentioned the colonel's strong feelings about celebrities who had avoided military service during Vietnam. Ladies and gentlemen, Carson announced to the studio audience and 30 million viewers watching at home, please welcome a true American hero, Medal of Honor recipient Colonel James Patterson. The audience erupted in thunderous applause as Patterson walked onto the set, his military bearing evident in every step. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, his medals catching the studio lights like badges of unquestionable authority. This was a man who had earned his place in American history through sacrifice, courage, and blood. Carson conducted what seemed like a respectful, routine interview with Patterson, discussing his military service, his book, and the leadership principles he had learned in combat. Patterson spoke eloquently about duty, honor, and the sacrifices made by American servicemen in Vietnam. His answers were crisp and confident, delivered with the moral authority of a man who had earned the right to speak about courage through personal experience. The studio audience hung on his every word, clearly moved by his stories of heroism under fire. Here was authentic American heroism, no Hollywood glamour, no publicity stunts, just a man who had repeatedly risked his life for his country and the men under his command. Colonel Patterson, Carson said as they neared the end of what everyone thought was a routine interview segment, you've dedicated your life to serving this country with honor. What are your thoughts on those who chose a different path during the war? It was meant to be a general question about military service versus civilian life, a softball query to wrap up the interview on a patriotic note. But Patterson's response would ignite a firestorm that neither Carson nor his producers had anticipated. Patterson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes hardened as he leaned forward in his chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction and barely controlled anger. Johnny, I believe that when your country calls, you answer. Period. Real men don't hide behind lawyers and religious exemptions. Real men don't let others fight and die in their place while they stay home making millions entertaining people. The colonel's voice was steady, but carried an edge that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. Though he hadn't mentioned any names, everyone in America knew exactly who he was talking about. Carson shifted nervously, sensing that his carefully planned show was about to spiral beyond his control. Well, Colonel, I know we have some strong feelings about. But before Carson could finish his diplomatic deflection, Patterson continued his attack with devastating precision, his voice rising with each word. There are men who talk about being the greatest, while real greatness was being demonstrated in the jungles of Southeast Asia. There are people who claim to be champions while the real champions were fighting and dying for the freedom that allowed them to become rich and famous. Patterson's voice carried the pain of a man who had watched good soldiers die while others lived in luxury at home. That's not courage, Johnny. That's cowardice dressed up in fancy words and protected by expensive lawyers. The studio audience fell into stunned silence. Carson's face went pale as he realized his show had just become a political lightning rod. In living rooms across America, 30 million viewers watched transfixed as this decorated war hero delivered what amounted to a character assassination of Muhammad Ali on national television. The attack was brutal in its precision and devastating in its moral authority. This wasn't a politician or a pundit offering opinions. This was a man who had earned 3 Purple Hearts calling someone else a coward. The weight of that accusation hung in the studio air like smoke from a battlefield. And speaking of courage, Carson said, his voice strained as he tried to regain control of his show, we'll be right back after this commercial break with heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali. The timing couldn't have been worse, or more dramatic. As the cameras cut away for the commercial break, Patterson remained seated on the couch, his devastating comments hanging in the air. Behind the scenes, panic erupted as producers frantically tried to decide how to handle the explosive situation they had inadvertently created. In the green room, Ali's handlers immediately surrounded him, their faces pale with concern as they explained what had just happened on live television. The atmosphere in the small room shifted from relaxed confidence to crisis management in seconds. We can leave right now, his lawyer advised urgently, pacing back and forth across the small room. You don't have to subject yourself to this kind of ambush. This wasn't what we agreed to when we booked this appearance. His trainer, Angelo Dundee, nodded in agreement, his concern evident in his voice. Champ, that man just called you a coward in front of the whole country. He's a war hero with a Medal of Honor. Nobody would blame you for walking away from this setup. Even Carson's own producers were suggesting they could end the show early, claiming technical difficulties or a medical emergency, anything to avoid the potential disaster of putting these two men together on live television. The smart move, the safe move, the expected move was for Ali to leave. He could release a statement later, let his lawyers handle the public relations fallout, avoid the confrontation entirely. Most celebrities would have taken that escape route without hesitation. But Ali, who had faced hostile crowds and death threats throughout his career, who had been called everything from traitor to terrorist by millions of Americans, who had lost his prime earning years and faced prison for his beliefs, made a decision that would define his legacy far more than any fight in the ring. No, Ali said quietly, his voice carrying a calm determination that surprised everyone around him. I'm going out there. His lawyer looked at him incredulously. Muhammad, this man has a Medal of Honor. He's a genuine war hero. The audience is going to be on his side. You're walking into a massacre. Ali stood up from his chair, straightening his tie and checking his appearance in the mirror. That man deserves to hear my side of the story, and America deserves to see how we handle disagreement in this country. As the commercial break ended and the cameras prepared to roll again, Ali walked onto the Tonight Show stage with the same confidence he brought to every boxing ring. But this time, his opponent was armed with moral authority, public sympathy, and the backing of 30 million viewers who had just watched a genuine war hero call him a coward. Carson's introduction was awkward and brief, his discomfort obvious as he tried to maintain professional neutrality in what had become an explosive situation. Ladies and gentlemen, Muhammad Ali. The applause was noticeably more subdued than usual, with many audience members clearly uncomfortable about cheering for a man who had just been labeled a coward by a genuine war hero. Ali took his seat next to Patterson, and the tension in the studio was so thick it seemed to press against the television cameras. The two men sat perhaps 3 feet apart on Carson's couch, but the distance between them felt oceanic. Patterson remained rigid in his military bearing, his jaw set and his gaze unflinching, clearly prepared for a confrontation. Ali, despite the hostility radiating from both Patterson and much of the audience, appeared remarkably calm. Muhammad, Carson began carefully, his voice betraying his nervousness. I imagine you heard Colonel Patterson's comments during the commercial break. Ali nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Patterson's face. Everyone in the studio, Carson, the audience, the millions watching at home, expected one of two responses, either an angry, defensive counterattack or the clever wordplay and braggadocio that had made Ali famous. Instead, Ali did something that shocked the 30 million viewers watching and completely disarmed Colonel Patterson. He stood up from his chair, walked the few steps to where Patterson sat, and extended his hand in greeting. Colonel Patterson, Ali said softly, his voice carrying none of the braggadocio that had made him famous. I want to thank you for your service to our country, and I want to thank you for saying what you believe. The gesture was so unexpected, so gracious in the face of public humiliation, that Patterson hesitated for a moment before shaking Ali's hand. The camera captured the moment, a handshake between two men who embodied completely different definitions of American courage, and broadcast it into millions of homes. Ali returned to his seat, but instead of the defensive posture everyone expected, he leaned forward and addressed Patterson directly, as if the cameras and 30 million viewers had suddenly disappeared and they were just two men having an honest conversation. Colonel, you said real men answer when their country calls, and you're absolutely right. Ali began, his voice steady and sincere. But can I tell you about the country that called me? What followed was one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered on television. Not because it was planned or rehearsed, but because it came from a place of absolute honesty and pain. The country that called Muhammad Ali was one where I couldn't eat lunch next to a white child, couldn't sleep in the same hotel as white people, couldn't even drink from the same water fountain. Ali said, his voice growing stronger but never losing its respectful tone. The America that wanted me to fight for freedom overseas was the same America that denied me freedom at home. When I was growing up in Louisville, Colonel, my people were being lynched, beaten, denied the basic rights that the Constitution promised to all Americans. Patterson's expression began to change as Ali continued, the rigid certainty in his eyes giving way to something else. Confusion, consideration, perhaps even the beginning of understanding. You fought for freedom in Vietnam, Colonel, and I honor that," Ali said, leaning forward with increasing intensity. "But I was fighting for freedom right here in America. When I refused to go to Vietnam, I wasn't running away from a fight. I was choosing which fight to fight." The studio audience, which had been silent with tension, began to murmur as Ali's words sank in. Here was a perspective many of them had never considered, that Ali's refusal to serve wasn't cowardice, but a different kind of courage. The courage to stand alone against an entire country for what he believed was right. Ali stood up and began pacing slowly in front of the couch, his hands gesturing as he spoke with a passion that reminded everyone watching why he was not just a great athlete, but a powerful speaker. "Colonel Patterson, you and I are more alike than different," Ali said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent studio. "We both looked at injustice and decided we couldn't stand by and do nothing. You fought injustice with a rifle in the jungles of Vietnam. I fought injustice with my voice and my career here in America." He paused, letting that parallel sink in before continuing. "You risked your life for your beliefs. I risked my freedom, my career, my prime earning years for mine. You served your country in uniform. I served my country by refusing to be silent about its failures." Patterson, who had come on the show prepared to deliver a moral lecture to a man he considered a coward, found himself listening to a perspective he had never considered. The conviction in Ali's voice, the sincerity of his explanation, and the respect he had shown despite being publicly humiliated was forcing the colonel to question assumptions he had held for years. "But, Colonel," Ali continued, his voice softening as he sat back down, "I want you to know something that's been weighing on my heart for years." The camera zoomed in on both men as Ali leaned closer to Patterson, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent studio. "Every day since I made that decision, I've thought about men like you. I've thought about the soldiers who went in my place, who faced dangers I never had to face. And I've wondered if there was another way, if I could have served my country and my conscience at the same time." The raw honesty in Ali's voice was devastating. Here was a man who had been painted as arrogant and unrepentant, revealing the doubt and pain that had haunted him for years. "You know what keeps me awake at night, Colonel?" Ali asked, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not the criticism or the hatred or even losing my title. It's wondering if my choice made things harder for men like you. It's wondering if standing up for what I believed in somehow dishonored the sacrifice of soldiers who believed in something different." The silence that followed was absolute. 30 million Americans watched as two men who had embodied opposite sides of the most divisive issue of their generation found common ground in mutual respect and shared pain. Carson, veteran of thousands of television interviews, found himself speechless in the face of such raw honesty and unexpected grace. The studio audience seemed to be holding their collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Finally, Colonel Patterson spoke, and when he did, his voice was thick with emotion that he was struggling to control. "Muhammad," he said, using Ali's chosen name for the first time, "I came here tonight believing you were a coward." Patterson's military composure was beginning to crack, his voice betraying emotions he hadn't expected to feel. "I came here believing that there was only one way to serve your country, only one definition of courage." He paused, and when the camera captured his face, viewers could see tears forming in the corners of his eyes. Tears from a man who had faced enemy fire without flinching. "But listening to you, seeing the respect you've shown me even after I attacked you on national television, I realize I was wrong about you. Not wrong about the importance of military service, but wrong about you as a man." The colonel stood up, his military bearing evident but somehow softened by the emotion of the moment. His voice grew stronger as he found the courage to admit what millions of Americans were struggling to accept. "You're not a coward, Muhammad. You're a different kind of soldier fighting a different kind of war. I may not agree with all your choices, but I can respect the courage it took to make them. And I can respect the man who made them." What happened next created one of the most powerful moments in television history. Colonel Patterson, the decorated war hero, who had come to humiliate Muhammad Ali, extended his hand, not in greeting this time but in apology. Ali took it and the two men embraced on live television, their reconciliation witnessed by millions of Americans who had been taught to see them as irreconcilable enemies. "I'm sorry, Muhammad," Patterson said, his words carrying the weight of genuine contrition. "I'm sorry for attacking you without trying to understand your perspective. I'm sorry for judging your courage by my definition instead of trying to understand yours." Tears were now openly flowing down Patterson's face. This man who had faced death in combat was crying on national television because he had discovered that his enemy was actually his brother. Ali's response would be quoted in newspapers across the country the next day. "Colonel, you have nothing to apologize for," Ali said, his voice gentle but strong. "You spoke from your heart about what you believe, and that takes courage too. We may have chosen different battles, but we both chose to fight for something bigger than ourselves. That makes us brothers, not enemies." Johnny Carson, finally finding his voice, addressed the cameras with tears in his own eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is something special. Two men who disagree fundamentally about one of the most important issues of our time, but who found a way to respect each other's courage and conviction. This is what America is supposed to look like." The impact of that 12-minute segment extended far beyond Studio 6B and continued to resonate through American culture for decades. The footage was replayed on news programs for weeks, analyzed by political commentators and social scientists, discussed in editorial pages across the country, and eventually studied in journalism schools as an example of how honest dialogue could bridge even the deepest divides. The moment became a cultural touchstone, referenced in books about leadership, conflict resolution, and the power of grace under pressure. More importantly, it changed how millions of Americans viewed both men and the complex moral questions surrounding the Vietnam War. Colonel Patterson and Muhammad Ali maintained an extensive correspondence for the rest of Ali's life, their unlikely friendship becoming a symbol of how Americans could disagree on fundamental issues while still maintaining respect for each other's character and convictions. They appeared together at numerous speaking engagements over the years, sharing their story as an example of how honest conversation could transform enemies into allies. Patterson became one of Ali's most articulate defenders in military circles, not because he changed his mind about the importance of military service, but because he learned to see courage in forms he hadn't previously recognized. He often spoke to veterans groups about how that night taught him that there are many ways to serve one's country, and that sometimes the most difficult service involves standing alone against popular opinion for what you believe is right. Years later, when Ali was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, Patterson was among the first to visit him. The war hero who had once called him a coward became one of his most devoted advocates, helping to establish programs for veterans and working with Ali on numerous charitable projects that served both military families and urban communities. In interviews near the end of his own life, Patterson would often reflect on that night on The Tonight Show as the moment that changed everything for him. "I thought I knew what courage looked like," he said in a 1995 interview. "I thought it was what I did in Vietnam, charging machine gun nests, pulling wounded men to safety under fire. And that is courage. But Muhammad taught me that courage also looks like standing up to your own government when you believe it's wrong. Courage looks like sacrificing your career for your principles. Courage looks like responding to hatred with respect." The night that was supposed to be Ali's humiliation became instead his greatest victory, not over an opponent, but over the hatred and misunderstanding that had divided America. By responding to attack with respect, to condemnation with compassion, Ali proved that true strength isn't about winning fights, but about the courage to see humanity in those who challenge us most fiercely. That 12-minute segment on The Tonight Show became proof that even in America's most divided moments, understanding was possible when people had the courage to listen to each other's stories, the wisdom to question their own assumptions, and the grace to change their minds when faced with unexpected truth. Muhammad Ali didn't just defeat a war hero that night, he transformed him, and in doing so, he showed 30 million Americans what real victory looks like, not the destruction of your enemy, but their redemption.